The forest doesn't forgive mistakes. It doesn't care about your experience, your training, or how many summers you've spent leading tourists down well-worn trails. Out there, beyond the marked paths where cell signals die and the canopy swallows the sky, nature operates by rules older than civilization itself. And sometimes, those rules allow things to exist that shouldn't. Things that watch, things that wait, things that follow. I've collected accounts from wilderness guides across North America. Men and women who've spent decades in the backcountry. These aren't campfire tales meant to scare children. These are testimonies from professionals who know the difference between animal behavior and something else entirely. What you're about to hear are 3 stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the wilderness. Stories that suggest we're not always alone out there, even when we desperately wish we were. The first account comes from a guide named Marcus Chen, who worked in the Cascade Range of Washington State for 17 years. Before this incident made him reconsider his entire career, Marcus specialized in multi-day backcountry expeditions, taking groups of experienced hikers deep into territory where most people never ventured. He prided himself on never losing a client, never facing a serious emergency, never encountering a situation he couldn't handle. That perfect record ended one October when he led a group of 6 into a remote section of the Cascades known for its pristine lakes and virtually untouched old-growth forest. The group consisted of seasoned hikers, all in excellent physical condition, all familiar with wilderness protocols. They planned a 5-day circuit through an area Marcus had traversed dozens of times. The weather forecast looked perfect. Everything seemed routine as they set out from the trailhead on a crisp autumn morning. The kind of day that makes you grateful to be alive and outdoors. By the time the sun began setting on that first day, Marcus would understand that some places don't want visitors. No matter how respectful those visitors might be. They made camp beside a lake so clear you could see 20 feet down into the depths. The water reflected the surrounding peaks with mirror-like precision, creating an almost supernatural beauty. As Marcus prepared dinner over the portable stove, one of his clients, a woman named Sarah, mentioned she'd seen something odd about a quarter-mile back on the trail. She described it as a pile of stones arranged in a deliberate pattern, too precise to be natural, but too crude to be an official trail marker. Marcus nodded, explaining that sometimes other hikers built cairns for various reasons, though he'd never noticed any in that particular location during his previous trips. What Marcus didn't mention was the uncomfortable feeling that had been building in his chest since they'd left the main trail. It was nothing he could identify specifically, just a subtle wrongness in the atmosphere, like the pressure change before a storm that never comes. The forest fell to quiet. In 17 years of guiding, Marcus had developed instincts he couldn't always explain, and those instincts were telling him something wasn't right, but he had 6 paying clients depending on his professionalism, and he wasn't about to spook them with vague feelings he couldn't justify. That night, as the group settled into their tents, Marcus lay awake listening to the forest. The silence bothered him. Even in remote wilderness, there should be sounds, small nocturnal movements, the rustle of wind through branches, the occasional call of an owl. But the forest around their camp seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. Marcus told himself he was being paranoid, that the stress of the season was catching up with him. He eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep, his hand resting on the flashlight beside his sleeping bag. He woke to screaming. The sound ripped him from sleep so violently that he was out of his tent before he fully understood what was happening. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the campsite. The screaming came from Sarah's tent. Marcus ran toward it, his heart hammering, his mind racing through possibilities. Bear attack, injury, medical emergency. What he found was Sarah sitting upright in her sleeping bag, trembling, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed toward the tree line, her hand shaking. Something had been watching her through the tent wall. She'd woken to see a silhouette pressed against the fabric, just standing there, absolutely motionless. The shape was wrong, she insisted. Too tall, too thin, standing in a posture that didn't look quite human. When she screamed, it had moved away, but not with the scrambling panic of a startled animal. It had backed away slowly, deliberately, as if it wasn't afraid of being discovered. Marcus conducted a thorough search of the perimeter with 2 of the male clients, all of them armed with bright flashlights and walking sticks. They found tracks in the soft earth near Sarah's tent, but the tracks made no sense. They were roughly foot-shaped, but elongated, with what appeared to be too many toe impressions. The stride length was impossibly long, suggesting whatever made them had legs much longer than a human's. Marcus photographed the tracks with his phone, though he knew the images would come out poorly in the flashlight beam. The rest of the night passed without incident, but nobody really slept. Marcus sat outside his tent, watching the tree line, his satellite phone within easy reach. He considered calling for an early extraction, but what would he say? That one client had seen a shadow and they'd found some weird tracks. Search and rescue wouldn't mobilize for that, and he'd look foolish. As dawn broke, washing the campsite in gray light, the forest seemed normal again. Birds sang. A light breeze stirred the trees. The oppressive silence of the night before had lifted. Marcus made a decision. They would pack up and move to a different campsite, one closer to the main trail. He told the group it was because he wanted to show them a better location, but everyone understood the real reason. Nobody argued. As they broke camp, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. All around the perimeter of their campsite, just inside the tree line, were more of those stone piles Sarah had mentioned. They formed a rough circle around where they'd slept, each pile consisting of rocks stacked with deliberate care. Marcus was certain they hadn't been there when they had made camp the previous evening. The hike to the new location took most of the morning. Marcus pushed a faster pace than usual, and the group sensed his urgency. They stopped for lunch beside a stream, and that's when Marcus realized they were being followed. He'd catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, always just behind them, always staying just out of clear sight. He'd stop, turn, scan the forest, and see nothing. But the feeling persisted, grew stronger. Whatever had visited their camp the night before hadn't let them go. By early afternoon, they reached a more established campsite, one that showed signs of regular use by other hiking groups. Marcus felt some of his tension ease. They set up camp in daylight this time, and Marcus made sure to arrange the tents in a tight cluster, no outliers. He built the campfire larger than necessary, stockpiling enough wood to keep it burning all night. The group ate dinner in subdued silence, everyone jumping at unexpected sounds from the darkening forest. As night fell, Marcus established a watch rotation. He didn't announce it formally, but he and 2 other clients agreed to take turns staying awake through the night. Marcus took the first watch, sitting close to the fire, feeding it regularly. The flames pushed back the darkness, creating a bubble of light and warmth. Beyond that bubble, the forest was an impenetrable wall of black. Around midnight, during the second watch shift, it happened again. Tom, one of the male clients on watch duty, shook Marcus awake. His voice was tight with fear. There were things moving in the forest, just beyond the firelight. Not one thing, but several. Tom had seen them circling the camp, staying just out of clear view, moving between trees with an unsettling fluidity. Marcus grabbed his high-powered flashlight and stood, his pulse racing. He swept the beam through the trees. The light caught something. For just a moment, Marcus saw it clearly. A figure standing behind a massive fir tree, partially concealed but not entirely hidden. It was impossibly tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, with proportions that looked wrong. The limbs were too long, the body too thin. Its skin, if you could call it that, seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But what Marcus remembered most vividly, what would haunt his dreams for years afterward, were the eyes. They reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's eyes, but the reflection was the wrong color. A pale, sickly yellow-green that seemed to glow with its own light. The figure didn't run when the light hit it. It simply stepped further behind the tree, moving with a smoothness that defied physics. Marcus swept his light through the rest of the forest and caught glimpses of others. They were surrounded. He counted at least 4 distinct figures, possibly more, all maintaining their distance, but clearly present, clearly watching. Marcus made a decision that probably saved their lives. He woke everyone up and told them they were hiking out immediately. Some of the clients protested. It was the middle of the night. They were exhausted. It was dangerous to hike in darkness. Marcus didn't argue. He simply started packing his gear and told them they could come with him or stay behind. Nobody chose to stay behind. They hiked for 6 hours through the darkness, Marcus leading with his brightest flashlight, the group staying close together in a tight cluster. The things in the forest followed them. Marcus could hear them moving parallel to the trail, keeping pace, never quite visible, but always present. Branches snapped in the darkness. Footsteps crunched on fallen leaves. Once, Marcus heard what sounded like breathing, deep and raspy, coming from somewhere in the trees to their left. They didn't stop. They didn't rest. They just walked, mile after mile, until the first gray light of dawn began filtering through the canopy. As the darkness lifted, the sense of being followed gradually faded. By the time they reached the trailhead parking lot, the forest behind them seemed empty, normal, innocent. Marcus never guided in that area again. He filed a report with the Forest Service, including the photographs of the tracks and a detailed account of what they'd experienced. The official response was polite but dismissive. There were no known animals in the region matching the description. The tracks were likely misidentified bear prints. The figures in the darkness were probably just shadows and stress-induced hallucinations. Marcus knew what he'd seen, and he knew the difference between imagination and reality. Here's what you should ask yourself. What else is living in those vast stretches of wilderness we rarely visit? We've mapped the terrain, marked the trails, given names to the mountains. But does mapping something mean we understand it? Does naming something mean we control it? The wilderness doesn't belong to us. We're visitors there, temporary and vulnerable, and some parts of the wilderness might actively want us gone. The second story comes from a woman named Rachel Kowalski, who worked as a guide in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, along the Minnesota-Canada border. This is one of the most remote and pristine wilderness areas in North America. A vast network of lakes and forests where you can paddle for days without seeing another human being. Rachel had been guiding canoe expeditions there for 12 years when she encountered something that made her question the very nature of reality. It happened during a late August trip with a family of 4, parents and their 2 teenage children. They planned a 7-day route through some of the most isolated lakes in the region, places with names that existed only on topographical maps, places where the water was so clear and cold it seemed to come from another world entirely. Rachel had run this particular route 3 times before without incident. She knew every portage, every campsite, every potential hazard, or so she thought. The first 3 days went perfectly. The weather was ideal, the fishing was excellent, and the family was experienced enough to handle the physical demands of wilderness canoeing. They saw moose, bald eagles, and a black bear at a distance. The northern lights made a surprise appearance on the 3rd night, dancing across the sky in ribbons of green and purple. It was the kind of trip that reminded Rachel why she loved her job, why she'd chosen a life in the wilderness over the security of a conventional career. On the 4th day, they reached a lake that didn't quite match Rachel's memory. The maps showed it clearly, and the GPS confirmed they were in the right location. But something about the lake felt wrong. The water was darker than it should be, reflecting the sky with an odd, oily quality. The surrounding forest seemed denser, more oppressive. Most unsettling was the complete absence of wildlife. No birds sang in the trees. No fish rose to disturb the water's surface. The lake felt dead, abandoned, as if every living creature with any sense had fled. Rachel considered suggesting they portage through to the next lake without making camp, but they'd already covered significant distance that day, and everyone was tired. The designated campsite on the map showed a clearing on the north shore. They paddled toward it, their paddles making the only sound across the unnaturally still water. Even the rhythmic splash of their strokes seemed muted, absorbed by the strange atmosphere. The campsite existed where the map indicated, but it showed no signs of recent use. In fact, it showed no signs of any use. The fire ring that should have been there, maintained by the Forest Service, was absent. The area that should have been cleared for tents was overgrown with vegetation. Rachel checked her GPS again. They were definitely in the right location. Perhaps the map was outdated, or the Forest Service had decided to let this particular site return to nature. They set up camp anyway. The family was too exhausted to push on, and the next portage was over a mile long, too much to tackle with fading daylight. As they worked to clear enough space for the tents, Rachel noticed something odd about the trees surrounding the site. Many of them showed signs of damage, deep gouges in the bark that looked almost like claw marks, but far too high off the ground to be from any animal she recognized. The marks were fresh, the exposed with still light colored, not yet darkened by weather and age. That night, as they sat around the campfire eating dinner, the father pointed out something in the water. About 50 yards from shore, something was breaking the surface, creating ripples that spread outward in perfect circles. At first, Rachel assumed it was a fish, but the disturbance was too large to sustain. Whatever was causing it stayed in roughly the same location for several minutes, occasionally creating larger splashes that suggested something substantial moving just beneath the surface. The family speculated it might be a large pike or muskie. Rachel nodded along but felt increasingly uneasy. She'd spent thousands of hours on these lakes and knew their rhythms, their patterns. This felt different, purposeful, as if they were being observed from the water. The disturbance eventually ceased, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had caused it was still there, just beneath the dark surface, watching their campfire. Sleep came reluctantly that night. Rachel dozed fitfully in her tent, the kind of light sleep where you're never quite unconscious, always aware of your surroundings. Around 3 in the morning, she woke completely, her heart racing. Something had changed in the atmosphere. The air felt heavier, charged with electricity like before a thunderstorm, though the sky had been clear at sunset. She unzipped her tent and looked outside. The moon was full, casting everything in silver light. The lake was perfectly still, its surface like polished glass, and standing at the water's edge, not 20 feet from the tents, was a figure. Rachel's first thought was that one of the family members had gotten up to use the bathroom area. They designated away from camp, but as her eyes adjusted and her mind fully processed what she was seeing, she realized this wasn't one of her clients. The figure was too tall, its proportions too strange. It stood at the very edge of the water, completely motionless, facing toward the camp. Rachel remained frozen, barely breathing, watching the figure. Minutes passed. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, a dark silhouette against the moonlit water, unnaturally still. No human could maintain such perfect stillness for so long. No human would stand at the water's edge in the middle of the night, wearing what appeared to be no clothing, and temperatures that had dropped into the low 50s. Then, slowly, the figure turned its head toward Rachel's tent. Even from the distance, even in the darkness, Rachel felt certain it was looking directly at her. The sensation of being seen, being studied, was overwhelming. Every instinct screamed at her to wake the others, to grab the flare gun she kept for emergencies, to do something. But she remained paralyzed, unable to look away from the figure at the water's edge. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two, the figure turned back toward the water. Then, with no hesitation, no testing of the temperature, it walked forward into the lake. It didn't wade or swim. It simply walked, maintaining its upright posture as the water rose past its knees, its waist, its chest. Within seconds, it had disappeared beneath the surface, leaving not even a ripple to mark where it had entered. Rachel sat in her tent for the rest of the night, unable to return to sleep, watching the water. The figure never reemerged, at least not where she could see it. As dawn broke and the others began stirring, Rachel faced a dilemma. Should she tell them what she'd seen? Would they believe her? Would it be better to pack up and leave immediately without explanation? She decided on a middle approach. She suggested they have breakfast and then move on to the next lake, claiming she wanted to make up some time to reach a particularly scenic location by evening. Nobody objected. As they loaded the canoes, Rachel kept glancing at the spot where the figure had stood. In the morning light, she could see impressions in the soft mud at the water's edge. Marks that looked roughly foot-shaped, but not quite right. The toes were too long, the heel too narrow. She didn't point them out to the others. They paddled away from the campsite, and Rachel felt a wave of relief as it disappeared behind them. But the relief was short-lived. As they crossed the lake, heading toward the portage point, Rachel noticed something moving beneath their canoe. A shadow, large and dark, keeping pace with them just below the surface. She watched it from the corner of her eye, not wanting to alarm her clients but unable to ignore its presence. The shadow followed them across the entire lake. It stayed perhaps 10 feet down, moving with an unsettling fluidity that didn't match any fish Rachel knew. As they approached the portage landing, the shadow suddenly dove deeper and disappeared into the darkness below. Rachel's hands were shaking as she guided the canoe to shore. The portage was brutal, over a mile of rough terrain carrying canoes and gear. But Rachel pushed them through it as quickly as possible, refusing to stop for breaks, claiming they needed to make time. The truth was she wanted to put as much distance as possible between them and that lake. Whatever was in those waters, whatever she'd seen at their campsite, she wanted no part of it. The remaining days of the trip passed without further incident, though Rachel remained on edge, constantly scanning the water, the shoreline, the forest. She never saw the figure again, never noticed any more strange shadows following their canoes. By the time they returned to civilization, Shadi almost convinced herself that exhaustion and the strange atmosphere that one lake had caused her to misinterpret natural phenomena. But 3 weeks later, Rachel received a call from a Forest Service ranger she knew. He'd been conducting a routine patrol in the area where Rachel's group had camped and had noticed something disturbing. The campsite on that particular lake had been completely destroyed. The trees surrounding it had been knocked down or stripped of their bark. The ground was torn up as if by some massive force. And most disturbing, there were dozens of those strange footprints, leading from the water's edge into the forest and back again, crisscrossing the entire area in a chaotic pattern. The ranger asked if Rachel had noticed anything unusual during her visit. She told him everything, expecting skepticism or dismissal. Instead, the ranger was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that chilled her to her core. That's the third report from the lake this summer. We've been trying to keep it quiet, but something's going on there. Something we don't understand. The Forest Service eventually closed the lake to camping, citing environmental concerns. The official reason given was erosion and the need to allow vegetation to recover. But Rachel knew the truth. They were keeping people away from something they couldn't explain, couldn't control, and couldn't protect anyone from. Think about this. How much of our world remains truly unknown? We like to believe we've cataloged everything, identified every species, mapped every corner. But the wilderness is vast, and the deepest waters hold secrets we can't begin to imagine. What lives in those places we rarely visit? What watches us from depths we can't see? And perhaps most unsettling, what might follow us when we leave? The third and final account comes from a man named David Ortega, who worked as a guide in the backcountry of Glacier National Park in Montana. Glacier is grizzly bear country, one of the few remaining strongholds for these magnificent and dangerous predators. David specialized in bear-aware hiking, teaching clients how to travel safely through areas where they might encounter wildlife. He'd seen dozens of grizzlies over his 15 years of guiding and had developed a healthy respect for their power and unpredictability. But what he encountered in the summer of his final season wasn't a bear, though it was infinitely more terrifying. David was leading a group of 8 on a multi-day trek through the northern section of the park. an area known for its stunning alpine meadows and glacier-carved valleys. The group was experienced and well-prepared, everyone carrying bear spray, following proper food storage protocols, making noise on blind corners. They'd seen a grizzly sow with cubs on the second day, watching from a safe distance as the bears fed on huckleberries. A perfect wildlife viewing experience that left everyone thrilled. On the third evening, they made camp in a designated area near a creek. The location was one David used regularly, familiar and well-maintained. As they set up camp, one of the clients mentioned seeing what looked like a person standing on a ridge, about half a mile away. The figure had been there for several minutes, just standing motionless, watching their group. David had looked but saw nothing. The client insisted they'd seen someone, a tall figure silhouetted against the sky. But by the time others looked, the ridge was empty. David didn't think much of it. Other hikers used the area, and it wasn't unusual to see people in the distance. He reminded everyone to store their food properly in the bear boxes provided at the campsite and to keep their bear spray accessible. As night fell, the group gathered around the campfire, sharing stories, enjoying the camaraderie that develops on multi-day trips. The sky was clear, the stars brilliant in the absence of light pollution. Everything seemed perfect. David woke around in the morning to the sound of the creek. Something about it seemed wrong. The normal babbling flow had changed pitch, become muted. He lay in his tent listening, trying to identify what had woken him. Then he heard something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps outside his tent, heavy and deliberate, moving through the campsite. His first thought was bear, but the footsteps didn't sound right. Bears move with a shuffling gait, and these footsteps were too regular, too purposeful. They sounded almost human, but heavier, each step creating a thud that David could feel through the ground beneath his sleeping pad. He grabbed his bear spray with one hand and his flashlight with the other, preparing to unzip the tent and confront whatever was outside. Before he could move, the footsteps stopped directly beside his tent. David could see a shadow through the tent wall, a massive shape that blocked out the moonlight. Whatever was out there was standing inches from the fabric, separated from him by only a thin layer of nylon. David held his breath, his finger on the trigger of the bear spray, his mind racing. The shape remained motionless for several seconds. Then David heard breathing, deep and raspy, unlike any sound he'd ever heard from a wild animal. The shadow moved away, the footsteps resuming, circling the entire campsite. David could track its progress by sound alone, listening as it moved past each tent, pausing briefly at each one, then continuing. Whatever it was seemed to be inspecting the camp, examining each tent's occupant. The footsteps eventually faded into the distance, heading toward the creek. David unzipped his tent and looked outside. The campsite appeared empty. All the other tents still sealed, no signs of disturbance. But the hair on the back of his neck stood up, and his hands trembled as he swept his flashlight beam across the area. He noticed the bear boxes were undisturbed, which was strange. If a grizzly had come through camp, it would have at least investigated the boxes where the food was stored. He walked quietly to the creek, following the direction the footsteps had taken. The sound of the water was indeed different, quieter than it should be. When David reached the creek bank, he understood why. Something was standing in the water about 20 yards upstream, blocking part of the flow. The figure was massive, at least 8 feet tall, standing in water that came up to its knees. It was facing away from David, looking upstream, absolutely motionless. David's training told him to back away slowly, to return to camp, to wake everyone and prepare for an emergency evacuation. But he stood frozen, unable to look away from the figure in the creek. The moonlight was bright enough that he could see its outline clearly. The proportions were all wrong. The arms hung too long, reaching almost to the knees. The head seemed too small for the massive body, and the skin, if that's what it was, appeared dark and textured, almost like bark. As David watched, the figure slowly turned its head, rotating far more than a human neck should allow. It looked directly at him. David couldn't see details of its face in the darkness, but he could see its eyes. to points of pale light that seemed to glow with their own luminescence. The gaze locked onto him, and David felt a wave of primal terror wash over his body. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to flee, to get as far away as possible. But something else held him in place, some quality of the gaze that felt almost hypnotic. Time seemed to stretch and distort. David couldn't tell if he stood there for seconds or minutes, locked in that visual exchange with the thing in the creek. Then, finally, the figure turned its head away, breaking the spell. It took one step upstream, then another, moving against the current with no apparent effort. Within moments, it had disappeared around a bend in the creek, leaving David standing alone on the bank, shaking uncontrollably. David returned to his tent, but didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, he conducted a search of the area where the figure had stood in the creek. The water was only about 2 feet deep in that section, the bottom mostly smooth stones. David found impressions in the creek bed, depressions in the stones and gravel that suggested something heavy had stood there. The impressions were roughly foot-shaped but enormous, easily 18 inches long. He photographed the impressions, then woke the rest of the group. He told them they were breaking camp early and hiking out via the shortest route possible. Some clients protested. They planned to more days in the backcountry, and they paid for a full experience. David was firm. They were leaving, and they were leaving now. His tone made it clear this wasn't negotiable. As they packed up and prepared to hike out, David noticed something that sent a fresh chill down his spine. All around the perimeter of their campsite, pressed into the soft earth, were more of those massive footprints. They formed a complete circle around where they'd slept, as if whatever had visited them had walked around the entire camp multiple times during the night. David counted at least 20 distinct impressions, maybe more. The thing had been there for a while, watching, circling, studying them. The hike out took most of the day. David pushed a brutal pace, stopping only briefly for water and quick snacks. He kept looking over his shoulder, scanning the tree line, unable to shake the feeling that they were being followed. Several times he thought he caught glimpses of something large moving parallel to their route, staying just out of sight in the dense forest. The clients sensed his anxiety and remained quiet, saving their energy for the demanding hike. They reached the trail ahead without incident, and David never mentioned what he'd seen in the creek. He told park rangers that one of the clients had felt ill, and he made the decision to evacuate early. The rangers accepted this explanation without question. David submitted his photographs of the footprints through unofficial channels to a researcher who studied unusual wildlife reports, but he never filed an official report with the Park Service. He knew how it would sound. He knew he wouldn't be believed. What haunted David most wasn't the size of the creature or even its terrifying appearance. It was the intelligence he'd sensed in that brief exchange of gazes. Whatever the thing was, it wasn't just an animal operating on instinct. It had studied their camp. It had examined each tent systematically. It had stood in the creek, watching him, making a choice about whether to approach or withdraw. That implied a level of cognition that shouldn't exist in something so physically removed from human form. David guided for one more season after that incident, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. The wilderness he'd loved now felt tainted, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with objective hazards like weather or terrain. He'd seen something that shouldn't exist, and the knowledge of its existence poisoned his relationship with the backcountry. He eventually took a job teaching wilderness safety at a community college, trading the mountains and forests for classrooms and parking lots. But sometimes, late at night, he still thinks about that figure in the creek. He wonders how many of them are out there, living in the deepest wilderness, watching us from distances we never notice. He wonders what they think of us, these strange two-legged creatures who blunder through their territory making noise, leaving trash, pretending we belong there. And he wonders what might happen if one of them ever decided that our presence was no longer acceptable, that we'd ventured too far into places where we're not welcome. Consider this final question. We mark trails, build shelters, create parks, and convince ourselves we've tamed the wilderness. But have we? Or have we simply been allowed to exist there, tolerated by things so much more powerful and mysterious than ourselves? The indigenous peoples who lived in these lands for thousands of years before us had stories, warnings about places not to go, things not to disturb, spirits that demanded respect and distance. We dismiss those stories as superstition, products of primitive minds trying to explain a world they didn't understand. But what if those stories were actually warnings? Hard-won wisdom passed down through generations of people who understood something we've forgotten. What if the wilderness isn't empty at all, but full of things we can't categorize, can't control, can't even fully perceive? What if every time we venture into the deep backcountry, we're being watched, evaluated, allowed to pass through or turn back by forces we don't acknowledge? Because acknowledging them would shatter our comfortable assumptions about reality. These three guides, Marcus, Rachel, and David, experienced something that changed them fundamentally. They saw past the veil of our carefully constructed understanding of the natural world, and what they saw suggested that the wilderness operates according to rules we don't comprehend. Rules that have nothing to do with our scientific taxonomies and everything to do with mysteries older than human civilization. The next time you venture into the wilderness, truly wild places beyond the reach of cell signals and maintained trails, remember these stories. Pay attention to the silences that last too long. Notice the tracks that don't quite match any known animal. Trust the instinct that tells you to. Leave an area even when logic says you're safe. Because somewhere in those dark forests, those deep waters, those alpine meadows untouched by human development, something else lives. Something that was there long before us, and will remain long after we're gone. And sometimes, just sometimes, those things decide to let us know they're there, watching, waiting, reminding us that we're not the apex predators we like to imagine ourselves to be. We're visitors in their domain, and our continued welcome depends entirely on their tolerance of our presence. The wilderness doesn't belong to us. We belong to it, whether we acknowledge the truth or not. Sleep well tonight, and be grateful you're reading this from the safety of your home, far from the deep woods where ancient things still walk and the old rules still apply.